Okay, folks, so we're going to pick up where we left off, and this time we're going to look at another perspective on the topic of euthanasia. So last time around we looked at Leon Kass's essay, Why Doctors Must Not Kill. This time around we're going to be looking at an excerpt from Peter Singer titled Justifying Voluntary Euthanasia. Just a little bit about Singer. We haven't yet encountered him in this current version of the class, but Singer is a utilitarian thinker, and he's perhaps one of the most well-known living philosophers in the world right now. He has argued for a number of positions, some of which have been rather controversial. One of his most famous views is that we should be giving a lot more money towards increasing famine relief. So in other words, if we can better spend our money on preventing preventable illnesses and helping people who are poor get fed, we should put our money towards that. So you shouldn't go out to a fancy restaurant. You shouldn't go out to the movies. You shouldn't buy that new guitar you've been thinking about. If you can prevent more suffering by spending it on famine relief, you should spend your money that way. He's also argued in favor of vegetarianism. His basic view is that you can get a perfectly good diet by eating plants, and it will not cause any suffering. So therefore, you should stop eating meat. So those are just some of his views. He's also argued in favor of things like euthanasia that we'll be looking at today. And more controversially, he has argued in some instances that in certain cases, infanticide should be legal. So infanticide is basically euthanasia for newborn infants, of course, in cases where these newborns have particular conditions that would make their lives short and painful. And perhaps not surprisingly, Singer has raised a lot of controversy, and some people find his views deeply mistaken on these grounds. Although others have found Singer's views to be quite plausible, clearly argued, and have offered them powerful ways to think about how to change their lives. So there are a lot of people who, after reading Singer's works, decide to give a lot of money to famine relief or to stop eating meat, for instance. So the excerpt on euthanasia that we're going to be reading today is from his book, a very popular book called Practical Ethics. When I was an undergraduate student, we had this version right here. Practical Ethics second edition. The third edition has been out. It was released sometime last decade. And Singer sort of puts his utilitarian approach to ethics on display, dealing with a number of topics, whether that be things like climate change, eating meat, euthanasia, abortion, among other things. So Singer's approach gives us a lot of different topics to think about. So we'll be sort of running through the paces on euthanasia this time around. So, Singer's main conclusion about euthanasia that we're going to be looking at for today is that voluntary active euthanasia is morally justified. So remember, voluntary euthanasia involves cases where a patient is asking a physician to hasten the end of their life in order to relieve them of the suffering that they're feeling, whether that be from the illness itself or whether it be from the nature of the treatment that they have to receive. And remember, active euthanasia is the sort where there is a particular substance, some kind of drug, being given to the patient that will cause that patient's death, rather than simply withholding certain life-saving treatments. And remember, when we're talking about active euthanasia, we're talking about that being administered to the patient by the doctor, as distinct from physician-assisted suicide. Those are cases where the patient themselves has to push the plunger on the syringe or take and swallow the pills themselves. So what's interesting here, remember we distinguished voluntary euthanasia from involuntary euthanasia and non-voluntary euthanasia. Non-voluntary euthanasia involves those cases where a no longer competent patient, they are no longer able to autonomously reflect on what to do, or they are simply unconscious. And in those cases, a proxy might make the decision for that person, whether that be a next of kin or whether that be a physician that is given those rights. But for this one, we're going to be focusing on voluntary euthanasia. And Singer points out that voluntary euthanasia is interesting and importantly different from these other cases because it involves the killing of a self-conscious and rational being. So what's interesting here is that Singer, especially as a utilitarian, is going to try to figure out what difference it makes to kill a self-conscious being as opposed to a being that is not self-conscious. So we'll just point out that when we have a non-self-conscious being, Singer has pointed out and given cases where he argues that it would make things better off if we euthanized a patient in a persistent vegetative state or a minimally conscious state. We talked about those in the CAS video a little while ago. So these are people who aren't really having any experiences or very low levels of experience. Their reflexes and their digestive system still work, but it's not like they're thinking or experiencing like you or I are currently able to think and experience. And Singer points out, as a utilitarian, that killing a self-conscious rational being is usually more morally serious than killing a merely conscious being. So the thought here is that if you're a self-conscious being, you have a richer inner life, right? You have more to think about. You can anticipate your death in the kind of way that a merely conscious being cannot. So in ordinary cases of killing, and we're not talking about euthanasia here, but just in general cases, that because self-conscious beings have richer experiences, it's going to be a bigger problem. It's going to be more morally serious when those kinds of beings are killed as compared to someone in a minimally conscious state, or we might even say, like, because you have richer consciousness than, say, a chicken, even though it's bad to kill a chicken, according to Peter Singer, it's worse to kill a self-conscious being. So in ordinary cases, killing a self-conscious being is worse. But Singer then goes on to say, and this is sort of an interesting little twist in his argument about euthanasia, he says that these morally relevant differences between self-conscious beings and merely conscious beings actually don't make voluntary active euthanasia worse. Remember, voluntary active euthanasia can only be requested and performed on self-conscious individuals. So you couldn't do it on somebody in a persistent vegetative state or arguably a chicken. So just to add in, why is it worse to kill a self-conscious being rather than a merely conscious being? Well, Singer says, and this is in the 3rd edition of his book, so this isn't in your textbook. He says, many beings are sentient and capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, so chickens, for example, but they are not rational and self-conscious, and therefore not persons. I shall refer to them as merely conscious beings. So usually it's worse to kill a self-conscious being than a merely conscious being. Because, and then he gives us 4 different ways of thinking about this difference. Classical utilitarians, who think about being better and worse off in terms of pleasure and pain. Self-conscious beings can fear their own death, and killing them is going to have a worse effect on others. 2, a preference utilitarian, and that's a utilitarian who, instead of thinking about pleasure and pain, thinks about satisfied preferences. The preference utilitarian is going to point out that when you kill a self-conscious being, you're thwarting a desire to go on living that a merely conscious being, again, like a chicken or somebody in a minimally conscious state, does not have. You and I, as rational beings, can see ourselves into the future, and therefore we have more complex and richer desires that can be satisfied. 3, theories of rights. So this gets into almost Kantian territory, interestingly. So a theory of rights, which treats you as a rational, autonomous being, says that you must have the ability to desire what you have rights to. So that to have a right to life, you must be able to desire your own continued existence. A chicken does not desire its own continued existence. It's not rational or autonomous, so it doesn't succeed on this sort of right to life argument. And then, even more Kantian, if we're just going to ground it in terms of autonomous rational agents, a person in a minimally conscious state is not a rational agent anymore. A chicken probably isn't. But you and I, as intelligent, desiring human beings, we have a special kind of personhood that's worthy of a special kind of respect. So with all of this in mind, you might think, oh, well, self-conscious beings are very special kinds of beings that have a special kind of moral importance, and therefore voluntary euthanasia, remember, which could only ever possibly be performed on a self-conscious being, must be a bad thing. But Singer argues, oh, quite to the contrary, it's quite the opposite. So he says that the considerations that normally make killing a self-conscious, rational being morally worse than killing a merely conscious being actually are going to make the case for voluntary euthanasia stronger. So, in terms of pleasure over pain, it does not necessarily lead to worse effects on others. Now, Cass is going to argue, as we notice, that voluntary euthanasia will then lead us down the slippery slope to involuntary euthanasia and a lot of non-voluntary euthanasia. But Singer points out that voluntary euthanasia, in and of itself, is just what people want, and we won't necessarily get the other thing, say non-voluntary euthanasia, or, heaven forbid, involuntary euthanasia. Second, voluntary euthanasia, remember how thwarting a person's desires is to make them worse off according to the preference utilitarianism? Well, according to preference utilitarianism, if you have a desire to die, then dying satisfies that desire. So it's not the case that killing a being with a preference to die makes it worse off. Now, you'll see that there's an interesting debate between Singer and Cass that comes up here. Because Cass argued in the last essay, we'll remember, that you can't be made better off by being made dead. But it seems that according to Singer, you can be made better off by being made dead. That is, in cases where you have a preference to be dead. So, voluntary euthanasia for a self-conscious being, when they've requested that euthanasia, is what they desire. And there's nothing incoherent about that, in spite of what Cass told us last time around. Third, voluntary euthanasia does not violate a person's right because they've waived that right. This raises some really interesting points. So, what Singer is saying is that certain rights are alienable. So what is it to have an alienable right? Well, it's a right that you can give up or decide that you don't want to press on other people. Let's think about some examples. Well, one is that you might think that you have a moral right to something if a person promised it to you, right? So, say if a person promises to give you $100 the next time they get paid, but then after that promise is made, you say, actually, I do not need that $100 from you, so I waive that promise. I release you from that promise. You had a right to that $100, but you've waived it. Or in other words, you've alienated that right. Right? Another good example from Singer, you have a right to privacy. Right? That right to privacy means that when you are in your private home, you are allowed to keep information about all of your doings to yourself, and to keep other people's business out of what you're doing at home. But you could decide on purpose to give up all your privacy. Maybe you might decide to film yourself all the time, every day, and put all of that film or all of that video footage up on the internet. We might think that you've alienated your privacy rights there. You simply voluntarily choose not to exercise your right to privacy. Now the thought here is that Singer thinks that your right to life, your right to insist on being able to continue to exist, is something that you can waive or alienate, just like your right to privacy. Now, Cass, on the other hand, is going to argue that there are certain rights that are inalienable. It's just alienable with an IN in front of it. So an inalienable right is like a right that you can't give up even if you try to. There are interesting cases here. The 17th century philosopher John Locke once very interestingly argued that your right to freedom and life is so great and so inalienable that you could never sell yourself into slavery. You always have a right to freedom, and you cannot give up your right to freedom as long as you choose. Now that's an interesting, perhaps super clear case of an inalienable right. We might then wonder whether the right to life is something like the right to privacy that you seemingly plausibly could voluntarily give up, or whether it's like the right to not be enslaved, which, according to most people's intuitions, is something that you can never give up. But we've got an interesting point from Singer here that once we start thinking about the notion of an alienable right, well, we might think that a patient who chooses to waive their right not to be killed might be able to let others do such a thing. Finally, voluntary euthanasia does not violate the patient's autonomy. It respects it. So the thought here is just that if a patient truly wants to die, then the way to respect that person's autonomy, and we can even get this out of Kant, right? Kant said that one part of the principle of humanity is to help other agents as far as you can achieve their ends, right? So it seems like respect for the autonomy of others would require us to help people achieve their sincerely stated desires. So even though it's usually worse to kill a self-conscious being, when a self-conscious being requests voluntary euthanasia, that actually gives us a lot of really good reasons to help that person achieve their wish of getting euthanasia. So, just to wrap things up, we'll consider some objections to Singer. Here's one question, and remember, this kind of came out of Cass, is that we can never be certain that a request for euthanasia is autonomous and rational. Here's how Singer responds: well, we should place restrictions that ensure doctors are reasonably sure. So that might be a matter of having 2 or 3 physicians check on the patient, have a certain waiting period, have a certain psychological evaluation on the patient to make sure that they are making their decision reasonably rather than in a moment of panic or out of pressure from, say, family members or even the physician. So the idea here would be we can put in certain bureaucratic measures to prevent abuse. 2, doctors can be mistaken about a patient's condition. We've probably all heard a lot of stories about somebody who is told that they only have a couple of months or a couple of weeks to live, and that person ends up surviving and living a happy and healthy life. Shouldn't that possibility make us always leery of taking the option of ending that person's life? Well, Singer points out that the amount of pain and suffering that we will prevent by legalizing euthanasia, by preventing a lot of unnecessarily lengthy and painful death processes, that will outweigh the fact that maybe there are a few cases where a euthanized patient might have gotten better. 3, no one should be so badly off that they want euthanasia in the first place. So this might also remind you of something that Cass told us, that what we should really be doing is promoting a culture of healing in the medical profession, such that nobody actually finds their life not worth living. Singer says, well, sure, in a perfect world, we would have everybody die peaceful enough deaths that they would never ask for euthanasia. But given that people are suffering and dying peaceful deaths, we shouldn't force people to suffer just because of how things ought to be in a perfect world. Here's another example that has nothing to do with medicine, per se. I've heard of some people who say that they don't tip because in a perfect world, waiters and waitstaff would be paid a living wage. Well, that's good and fine, but that's what things would be like in a perfect world, not in the actual world that we live in. And when you refuse to tip waitstaff, that is causing them a lot of hardship. So the thought here, I think that the parallel line is that we shouldn't force actual people to suffer on the basis of our idea of how things would be in a perfect world. So this is all to say, tip your servers. Here's another case. You might say that preventing euthanasia is a case of justified paternalism. So paternalism is just the idea of forcing people to do certain things for their own benefit. So one example of justified paternalism might be something like legally requiring a person to wear a helmet when they ride a motorcycle. If you're not going to look after yourself, the state will step in and make sure you do. Other cases of justified paternalism may be warnings on cigarette packets, right? Doing what we can to help people from making bad choices that will make them worse off. But Singer points out that if euthanasia actually is an overall benefit, if it prevents people from living a last stretch of life that is worse than not living at all, then we can't prohibit euthanasia on paternalistic grounds, because a good paternalistic argument depends on the thought that we are actually making somebody better off. And when we actually look at a person's personal narrative, and this is something that Singer appeals to in his essay, it doesn't seem for people who want euthanasia that they're made better off by being made to keep living. And if that's the case, if he's right about that, then justified paternalism can't be a grounds for banning euthanasia. So just to sum up, Singer has argued that voluntary euthanasia can be justified more easily than other versions of euthanasia, like non-voluntary euthanasia. We might also notice that Singer's argument doesn't necessarily depend on utilitarianism. Now, this response, that the amount of pain and suffering we can prevent by having euthanasia trumps the possibility of mistake cases, that's very utilitarian reasoning. But even if you were a Rossian pluralist, right? Remember, Rossian pluralists have duties of beneficence and non-maleficence. So they may also agree with the force of Singer's reasoning. And I even pointed out that Kantians believe that respect for the humanity of others requires us at least to sometimes help others achieve their ends. And perhaps one of the ends we might be required on Kantian grounds to sometimes help others achieve might be the end of ending one's life with as little suffering as possible. So you don't have to be a utilitarian to find plausible defenses of euthanasia, even active voluntary euthanasia, in Singer. So that'll wrap things up, and I'll leave it to you to reflect on. What do you think? Is Singer's argument on track? Should we be allowing voluntary active euthanasia? Or is Cassmore right? Remember, his thought was that doctors have a duty, as doctors, to never intentionally bring about the deaths of their patients. So again, I'll look forward to hearing all your thoughts about this complex, interesting, and also a deeply important issue. So thanks for listening in, and be in touch. Thanks. Bye.